membership meeting, and we've got a lot of things on tap today. First of all, this morning, state and federal, from the cemetery commissioner to the state. And this is a classic project of the league, and we do it every other year. So this is a new edition, and she's not here today, but Shereen Hale has worked very hard to get this out. And if you happen to find any errors, we've all looked it over and proofread it for her, but you never can have too many eyes, so if you can read through it and find any glaring errors, please let me or Shereen know. Also, our April 8th program will be Allison McCaffrey. She is from the State League of Women Voters in Seattle, and her specialty is redistricting and the census. Now, I know that sounds a bit on the dry side, but she is a very dynamic speaker, and this is a very compelling issue, particularly with the census coming up next year. Also, please mark your calendars. Note May 15th is our annual meeting luncheon, which will be at the Grange. And remember, this is a Wednesday. It's not a Monday. So May 15th, Wednesday, annual meeting luncheon. And our featured speaker will be Superintendent Carrie McVeigh from the local school board. School district. She is superintendent. She's done a wonderful job, and she's going to be in the position another year, and she's going to speak on special education as well as the complex financing that goes into the financing our schools, particularly in light of the Cleary decision. Also, one last thing. If any of you have pins that need names, Marty has the machine to put your name on your badge. So, see Marty afterwards. Now, Audra, to whom we owe gratitude for the lovely cupcakes we have today. And if you could say a few words about that.
Okay, so I woke up this morning and I realized I was feeling really excited about this meeting, and I thought, oh well, I like meetings, but what's the excitement? And then I thought, I am remembering the stories that my mother told me about her cousin, Alice Stone Blackwell. And I'm remembering that Alice Stone Blackwell was a woman who put her entire life to the women's suffrage movement. So in 1919, 100 years ago, she gathered together with a whole group of women whose names we know, like Carrie Chapman Catt and all that sort of stuff. And I was dreaming in some way and turning it into the day about the excitement that they must have felt as they were sitting there saying, this is going to happen. It's going to happen. Now, 100 years ago, in 2 months, the Congress passed that legislation. Okay. Of course, then it had to go to the states to get ratified, and as I was reminded reading the poster back there, is that we here in Washington already had the vote, but that the whole country had the vote 14 months later. But there was another thing that was on these women's minds, and they said, wait a minute, it's not over, not by a chance. And I want to say a couple more things about Alice Stone Blackwell and what she had done. She was credited with being very influential in bringing together the two branches of the Women's Suffrage Association around 1870, more or less. What had happened, and it had been really dangerous to the movement, was that when it came time for the 15th Amendment, one group of women said, we support the amendment. Now, yes, women are not included, but it includes everybody regardless of race or religion. And this is a very important step forward. We should support it. This is the group led by Lucy Stone. There was another group led by Stanton, Sophia Kent suddenly. And what's her name? You know who I'm talking about.
Yes.
Thank you. And Anthony. Okay, those two. And they said, no way. It's women or nothing. And so the group split apart with people really fighting over this question of race and gender, how these priorities are to be dealt with. I mean, the issue is not dead, right? But what happened is that Alice Stone Blackwell is credited for having done a lot of saying, look guys, the situation in 1870 is that it is now time to focus on women, and she managed to bring people together. And she was editor of the Women's Journal, their major paper, for many years. Okay, so here I'm sitting, here are these women, they're all saying, I believe, what next? We've got Congress, we're going to get the states, what next? And then they said, we need an organization that will take us all to the future. It doesn't mean anything to have the vote if you don't know how to use it, if you don't know why you're going to use it the way you are. And so 10 months, 11 months later, these people forming the group said, we will call ourselves the League of Women Voters. And so that was their third big step to get the league started. So I'm there saying to myself, well, who are we then? And I said, we today are a dream fulfilled. And in honor of that, we have cupcakes.
Thank you, Audra. And I'm pleased to welcome Lovell Pratt as our speaker today. She's currently the Marine Protection Program Director of Friends of the San Juans. And she's a longtime island resident, and she's been one of us, a league member for a long time too. And she has a long history of community involvement. She served a term on the San Juan County Council in 2008 to 2012. And she was appointed to the Washington State Association of Counties to represent our county on several regional and statewide oil spill prevention committees. She served on the VTRA, which stands for Vessel Traffic Risk Assessment, working groups in 2010 and 2015, and she's the environmental representative on the Puget Sound Harbor Safety Committee and a member of the Governor's Southern Resident Killer Whale Recovery and Task Force. And she's also on the San Juan County Marine Resources Committee, and please welcome Lovell Pratt.
Well, thank you all so much for being here today. I just want to let you know, just to get started, that I've got some information on the back table, and I'm going to send around, if you're interested in signing up to receive email alerts when there's an opportunity to take action. I'm going to talk at the end of the presentation about what actions you can take to help support the protection and recovery of the Southern residents. So I'll just pass this around in case people aren't on our list and want to join it. Also in the back are event postcards that just went out to our membership. There's extra copies there if you want them. This is our 40th anniversary, so that's a big milestone for Friends of the San Juans. We're going to have celebrations for our 40th anniversary on each of the islands, and also one in Seattle. And so the one here on San Juan Island will be on October 12th at the Yacht Club. But some of these events are great, and for me, we don't have a boat, we don't get to go out to the other islands, so it's a great opportunity to get out and see the other islands that aren't ferry served. So like, for example, May 1st, there's a trip out to Yellow Island to see the wildflowers. And then I'm really excited about August 8th. I'm going to be on the trip going out to Stewart Island. And we'll get to walk out to the lighthouse and see the vessel traffic right there at Turn Point from the shores of Stewart Island. So anyways, those postcards are in the back if you're interested. And you don't have to be a member to sign up for these events. You just have to sign up. And there is a charge. It's not a fundraiser, but to cover boat costs and that kind of thing, to cover our costs. Also, I want to let you know that next Thursday at the Grange, it just happened that I'm doing some presentations with Dr. Deborah Giles, who's a whale scientist here on San Juan Island. And we had originally scheduled these back in February, but if you remember that snowstorm we had to reschedule. So, so there will be some similarities with my presentation here today and the one Giles and I will be doing next week, but it's a great opportunity to learn about the research that she's doing on the Southern residents, and she's a great presenter, so I recommend that. So this presentation has about 40 slides, and of course we can get to questions at the end, but if you do have a burning question during any of the slides, as long as it doesn't interrupt too much, feel free to ask. And then I'm going to send some additional information to Barbara, and I've compiled a list of things that I think you'll be interested in, but if there's things that you want more information about, please let me know, and I can also add that to the material I'll send to Barbara, and then she can send to all of you. So, oops, oh good, thanks. So just to get started, especially being here at the League of Women Voters, I really want to introduce you to my awesome coworkers. So going from left to right, we have Tina Whitman, Shannon Davis, me, our new staff attorney, Jennifer Barcelos, our director, Stephanie Buffum, Jan Sandberg, Katie Fleming, Michelle Vekved, and Jessica Newley. And when Tina's son, Soren, who's 10 years old, when he realized that his mom's coworkers were all women, he was like, wow, Mom, you're going to get a lot done. So I couldn't agree more. Okay, so getting started, I just want to ground us in our geography. And what's so important about our amazing marine ecosystem is just to understand it in terms of it being a transboundary marine ecosystem. And when the Salish Sea officially was named in 2010, I really think that helped to heighten the awareness of the importance of this total transboundary marine ecosystem that we live in. And of course, there we are, the San Juan Islands, right there in the center. And this, this presentation is all about what we can do to help recover and protect the southern resident orcas. And this is the critical habitat that's been identified by our national NOAA, National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. Yeah, acronyms are always tough, but if I use an acronym in the presentation and you don't know what it means, please just ask. So the Friends of the San Juans was actually a petitioner, a co-petitioner that led to the southern resident killer whales being listed as an endangered species under the Endangered Species Act in the US. And that took place in 2005. And Canada actually listed the southern residents on their kind of equivalent list in 2003, the Canadian Species at Risk list, or Canadian Species at Risk Act. And here we can see where the southern residents spent their time, and this is from 1976 to 2014. And you can see that they primarily are in the western side of San Juan Island and Haro Strait and Boundary Pass up into the southern Georgia Strait, eastern Strait of Juan de Fuca. That's the primary area they're in. What's changed in recent years, just in general, is that they're here less, and when they are here, they're spread out more. They aren't clumped together in groups as much as they used to be. And then this is from the governor's office. This is the population of the southern resident killer whales over time. And you can see that there's been a 24% decrease in their population between 1995 and 2018. Now this was a chart that was put out last November, and we now have 75 southern resident killer whales. A new calf was born, and as of last week is still alive and doing well. So that is really good news. So, but because of the population decline and the fact that the southern resident killer whales are critically endangered at this time, our governor established this recovery and task force last year. And this is the organizational chart. And you can see that there are 3 working groups that correspond with the 3 primary threats to the health of the southern residents. And the three key threats are pollution, and that's both actual and potential pollution, and lack of prey. So not only has the amount of Chinook salmon declined, but the size of the fish have also the fish have gotten smaller over time. And then vessel impacts, so the noise and the presence of vessels. And what's important to understand about these threats is that they're interrelated. So fundamentally, the orcas are starving. And so they're not getting enough to eat. But what they do eat contains contaminants, and those contaminants get stored in their blubber. And when the orcas don't get enough to eat, and when they have to expend additional energy because they're impacted by boats, they're avoiding boats, or they're having difficulty foraging for food, finding food, and they have to put more energy into getting the scarce food that's out there, that burns off the blubber that has the contaminants that then go into their bloodstream and impact their health. So there are other killer whales who are actually even more contaminated than our southern residents, but it doesn't affect them in the same way because they're getting plenty to eat. Okay, so that's these threats are all linked. I'm going to just give one example of pollution impact to the southern residents, and that's PCBs. And I have to look up the real name here. Polychlorinated biphenyls. So these are carcinogens, and back in the 70s, there was a ban on their production, but they're still allowed to be used in contained uses, like in capacitors. And what happens is the PCBs leach out in the stormwater or surface runoff, and they go into the water, and then they get magnified as they go up the food web. So, from the zooplankton up to the forage fish, up to the salmon, and up to the southern resident killer whales. So that's, how those contaminants get stored in the southern resident killer whale's blubber, and then when they don't get enough to eat, or they have to expend extra energy to get the food that's out there, the scarce food that's out there, and it releases into the bloodstream, that's what causes a lot of problems for them health-wise. And there's certainly a lot more contaminants out there. I'm just giving you one example. Okay, lack of prey. So again, it's not just that the numbers of Chinook salmon, which are the southern residents' preferred prey, it's not just that the numbers of salmon are going down, but the size is getting smaller. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but according to the Department of Fish and Wildlife, the average size of the Chinook salmon now are between 10 and 15 pounds. And so one good question is, okay, well, how many Chinook salmon do the southern residents need? And there's differing opinions about this, but going with the Department of Fish and Wildlife's average size of a Chinook from 10 to 15 pounds, NOAA says that the southern residents will eat 30 a day, so that's approximately 30 a day. And if you multiply that by the number of the population, 75, times the number of days in the year, you get 821,250 Chinook salmon per year. Now, the Department of Fish and Wildlife has a different estimate of the total number of fish per year, but this is the number that Dr. Deborah Giles has given me, and I'm going with that. And we're going to talk later about whether we need to allocate or we need to advocate for a Chinook allocation to the southern residents, just like they allocate fish to commercial fisheries or recreational fisheries, that kind of thing. And now just getting back to our own geography in the San Juan Islands, this is a great illustration of how important our shorelines are to juvenile salmon. So juvenile salmon, 20 of the 22 wild Chinook salmon stocks from Puget Sound come to the shorelines of the San Juan Islands to rear when they're juveniles. So they come here and they grow a little bit bigger before they out-migrate to the open ocean. And it's a really critical component of a really critical service that our island shorelines provide. And you've probably seen this graphic that Friends of the San Juans has, but I wanted to just give you a quote from the from NOAA. They talk about how the San Juan Islands are uniquely beneficial for juvenile Chinook salmon rearing. We've got cooler water temperatures, we've got the availability of forage fish. So that's a real important thing that our islands provide to the orca's food web. Okay, now I'm going to talk about the other threats. We've talked about the threat of pollution, actual pollution. We've talked about the threat of the lack of prey, and now talking about vessel impacts. So the large commercial vessels, the noise from those ships is mainly interferes with the orca's ability to communicate. These are highly social whales, and it's like if you're at a party and it's really loud and you just got to talk louder, to be heard by whoever you're talking to, and it takes more energy, right, to communicate in a loud space. And that's what the orcas are experiencing when they're in the water and one of those big commercial ships go by. And then the smaller boats also are impactful to the orcas in a couple of ways. One is in terms of the noise that the smaller boats, like the recreational and whale watch boats, those noises interfere with their ability to echolocate. So the southern residents echolocate to find the Chinook salmon prey, and so interfering with their ability to hunt makes it so that they have to hunt all the more for the scarce salmon that are out there. And the other issue with the boats is that just by their presence, the orcas avoid the boats, so they have to expend more energy avoiding the boats. And this graphic shows that when boats are present, the orcas spend less time foraging and more time traveling. And then Washington State ferries. So one of the main reasons that Washington State ferries is an impact to the southern residents is just because of the sheer volume of ferry traffic. So for the vessel traffic service managed by the U.S. Coast Guard, 70% of the traffic they manage are ferries. And there'll be a future slide where we'll see how that number, oh, and I want to go back, sorry, I forgot one thing. So with the smaller boats also, there's the echo sounders that are used on these boats. There's a 50 kilohertz frequency that overlaps with the orca's echolocation that could interfere with their ability to echolocate. The 200 kilohertz does not. So that we're trying to make boaters aware, like if the orcas are present and it's safe to do so, turn off your echo sounders, so it won't interfere with their ability to hunt. Okay, so the task force, ultimately what the southern residents really need is more fish. They need more Chinook salmon, and they need 30% more Chinook salmon than what's out there, according to this paper that was done with a population viability analysis. That's a big lift to increase the Chinook population by 30%. One thing that they modeled in this paper was that they could achieve a similar success of a 2.3% population growth per year if they increased Chinook availability by 15% and decreased vessel impacts by 50%. So that's something, that paper is something that the Southern Resident Killer Whale Task Force really looked to in identifying their goal to do just what that paper said. Increase Chinook availability by 15%, decrease vessel noise and disturbance by 50%. But the bottom line is they need more fish, right? So now I'm going to talk about the potential pollution impacts to southern residents. If you read the decision to list the southern residents as an endangered species, one of the reasons given is the risk of oil spills in our region. We're the 5th highest refinery state in the nation, and the Exxon Valdez oil spill had a huge impact to some of the population, the killer whale populations there. But I also just want to highlight this oil spill because we're coming up on the 30-year anniversary. March 24th will be the 30th anniversary of the Exxon Valdez oil spill that spilled over 10 billion gallons of oil, crude oil, in this pristine wilderness and continues to affect the community to this day. So this is a picture from May of last year, so just a little over 29 years after the spill, and there's still oil on the beaches. And so that, the herring population crashed. It has never recovered. That fishery is still closed. there are many ways in which this spill still impacts the communities there. And one of the significant ones relevant to the southern residents is the fact that there were 2 pods of orcas in the vicinity of the Exxon Valdez oil spill. One of them, the AT1 population, will never recover. I mean, it's functionally extinct at this point. The AB pod actually is showing signs of recovery over this long period of time. They still haven't gotten back to the population levels, pre-spill population levels, but they are showing signs of recovery, which is great. But it's really concerning. If our southern residents should be in the vicinity of the spill, they could become extinct. So this is a map that's from Canada that shows both the U.S. and Canadian priority habitats for the southern resident killer whales and their foraging areas. And I want to just overlay that with the commercial vessel traffic lanes for these same waters. And so these are, there's actually a very good system of management between the U.S. and Canada. So when vessels are in the Strait of Juan de Fuca, whether they're, whichever side of the border they're on, those vessels are managed by U.S. Vessel Traffic Service. If vessels are in Haro Strait or Boundary Pass, whichever side of the border, all of that waterway is managed by Canadian Vessel Traffic Service. So, and they, they have a good system set up to cooperatively manage our waterway, our transboundary waterways here. But I've got this slide here. I wanted to show you what the 2017 vessel traffic looks like, but I put in some historical data. I wanted to point out that it wasn't until 2011 that we started having ATBs, or articulated tug and barges, in our waterways. And I bring that up because there's some current legislation in Washington State that addresses articulated tug and barges specifically. But these are tank vessels that don't have the same regulatory requirements as tankers. They don't have the same crewing requirements. They don't have the same tug escort requirements. So that's a concern. And you can see, even though they represent a small percentage of the vessel traffic in our waters, the number of ATBs are going up. But of course, the vessel traffic, even though we have, it's like 15,000 vessel transits a year, it's dwarfed by the number of Washington State and BC ferry transits, because those vessels, even though there aren't that many ferries, I mean, in terms of number of boats, they're back and forth, 24/7, So that's why they have so many transits in our waterways. And then what's not on this map are the recreational boats. And so as in the introduction, you heard that I'm the environmental representative on the Puget Sound Harbor Safety Committee. And that's a great group. It works to identify proactive ways to better manage the vessel traffic in these waterways, and it uses standards of care to do that. So implementing a standard of care isn't the same, like if you were to implement a federal regulation that changes the way shipping is managed in our waterways, it could take a decade, maybe even longer. It's a very long process. A standard of care happens pretty quickly, and the way I understand it is, while it's not a regulatory mandate, it can be, if you don't follow a standard of care that's out there, you could be faulted in a court of law. And I don't understand all the nuances about that, but it's a great way to proactively manage our waterways. And we get reports on incidents. So these are incidents that don't result in an accident or an oil spill, but they really help to inform if there are repeating incidents in a certain area, then we know, a standard of care is needed to address this, and let's take care of this before an accident does happen. And often the incidents are between large commercial vessels and recreational boats, and that is really concerning. And we never want a captain or a pilot of a ship to have to choose between hitting a recreational boat or going aground and maybe causing an oil spill. So anyways, that's not in the mix here, but you all know how popular our area is for recreational vessels. So now I'm going to just talk for a minute about oil spill risk. I gave a presentation years ago to this group about the 2010 Vessel Traffic Risk Assessment. we now have the 2015 vessel traffic risk assessment. And I'm just going to talk about, this is from the 2015 vessel traffic risk assessment. And I'm just going to show you 2 slides. And this is a 3-dimensional geographic depiction of oil spill risk by volume for existing 2015 vessel traffic. And I just see the San Juan Islands right there. It's kind of a little bit hard to read this map. But this is where the oil spill risk is as of the 2015 vessel traffic. And this is what happens when you add the projected increases in vessel traffic.
Lovell, where was the San Juan Islands on that map?
Right there. So this is Rosario Strait here, and these big spikes are near where the refineries are in Anacortes and the Guaymas Passage in there. And then over here we've got Harrow Strait and Boundary Pass. Is that okay? So this is actual vessel traffic in 2015, and this is 2015 traffic with the additional vessel traffic that's projected. So you can just see the change. There's still a lot of oil spill risk in the Rosario area and Saddlebags and Guaymas channels, but now a lot more risk of oil spills in Harrow Strait and Boundary Pass. Just do it one more time. Okay. So, and we all know that if you increase vessel traffic, it has a corresponding increase in the risk of oil spills. And I'm going to just highlight a couple of the projects that were analyzed in that 2015 vessel traffic risk assessment in terms of the projected increases in vessel traffic. One of the big ones is the Trans Mountain Pipeline Expansion Project. This was formerly a Kinder Morgan project, but it's now Canada's project. Canada bought the project. And just recently, I think it was January 22nd, Canada's National Energy Board again recommended approval of the project. It's still a decision that Parliament will need to make, and the Prime Minister. But this would add an additional 696 tanker transits going through Harrow Strait, Boundary Pass, and the Strait of Juan de Fuca.
Per year?
Per year. Yeah, it would be a huge increase. So right now there's about 60 tankers a year going to and from the terminal in Vancouver, and it would go up to 408 tankers a year.
Dear God.
Another huge project, yes,
Are there suits ongoing in Canada to stop that?
Yes.
absolutely, yes, yes. And I'm sure in all likelihood there will be more. And you know, I think I don't totally understand the governmental system there in Canada, but I think there's going to be an election towards the end of this year, and so the outcome of that will be a deciding factor also. Yeah. Another big project in Canada, just north of the border, is Roberts Bank Terminal 2. I don't know if you can see the U.S.-Canadian borders right there. So this is in Delta, British Columbia, that you drive by on I-5 just after you cross the border. So this would be a brand new, built out on the water container ship terminal that would add 468 to 520 container ship transits per year. And these are the big container ships, like the 18,000 TEUs. Yes, Cheetah?
I was at a get-together in Vancouver and visited with a number of folks there that are very active in politics. And the consensus was that there would be an accident, and it wasn't, if but when. And it was it was like this, and so I started reading books on tankers in our area, and I had to stop because I got myself so upset.
Yeah.
But it's a problem we all need to.
Yeah, I really don't want to say it's not a matter of if but when, because I really want to be hopeful that we have the momentum and we have the political will to implement preventative measures. We'll get into this a little bit later, but typically oil spill prevention always comes after a big spill, which is so tragic. And I really don't want that to happen here. But it's a really tough lift to to be able to implement preventive measures or to say no to these projects if the risk is too high. So this project here, the Lummi Nation has been very active in opposition to Roberts Bank Terminal 2. And there was just a hearing up in Canada in January, and the Lummi Nation were there, and they had a press event. And I'll send a link to some materials to Barbara about this, and there's a video that you can watch. But they basically are asking for a moratorium on permitting any new projects until we've had a thorough assessment of what our waterways are really capable of in terms of vessel traffic in a sustainable way. And so, definitely support that effort that the Lummi Nation is putting forward, and that really makes a lot of sense, because one of the challenges when new projects are the applications going for new projects is to really understand, well, what are the cumulative impacts, not just of this project, but this project in combination with another project that's, in the permitting process. Like we not only have Roberts Bank Terminal 2 that's in the permitting process, but also the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion. And those boats are all going to be going through the same, vessel traffic lanes. So coming down here into the U.S., one of the projects that was studied in the VITRA 2015 is the Tesoro refinery in Anacortes that got rebranded as Endeavor and then was bought by Marathon. And they submitted an application to manufacture and export xylene. So what the refineries are looking at are, as demand for traditional refinery products goes down, as we use less gasoline and diesel and those kinds of products, they're looking to diversify and manufacture petrochemical products that can be used in manufacturing, like xylene. This would be a product that they would export to China, and it would be used there in manufacturing plastics and films and those kinds of products. It's a highly volatile product, and it's a new petrochemical product for our waterways. Xylene's an ingredient in all of those petroleum products, but like small fraction. What they'd be producing is this highly purified xylene. Friends of the San Juans is one of 6 organizations that is appealing this permit decision. We're now at the Superior Court in Thurston County level in terms of our appeal process, so stay tuned. And then another project that just cropped up that was not studied in the Vessel Traffic Risk Assessment 2015, just last November, Par Pacific purchased the U.S. Oil and Refining Company in Tacoma. This is Washington State's smallest refinery, but Par Pacific purchased it specifically to transport crude oil from both U.S. Bakken crude and Canadian crude to their 2 refineries in Hawaii. So this would increase oil tanker traffic in the Salish Sea to some unknown amount. And that, that's a project that just, that's, as of November 27th when they, shared this presentation with their shareholders. I heard about it in December, and so it's just happening now. There is the Army Corps of Engineers, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers was in a multi-year process to do a dredging project in the Blair Waterway in Tacoma, which is where this refinery is located. And they happen to have a comment period that just ended recently, so we sent in comments about this particular issue, and maybe that'll get addressed there. And we're also communicating with the Department of Ecology, just wanting to be sure that there's a permit that's required for them to change the use of this refinery facility that will address the state's Environmental Protection Act and will address the impacts from the increase in shipping. But that remains to be seen. Okay, so now we're going to do an update on the legislation that's currently in process. Let me get my notes here. So last Thursday, March 7th, was a banner day for state legislation that benefits southern resident killer whales. And in future slides, just so you know, I used underline and strikeout to show the changes from the current status, from the original bills to the current status. But this bill here addressing the need to increase Chinook salmon availability for the southern residents. This bill really looks at how the shorelines play a critical role in the food web for the southern residents. So one thing it does is it gives more authority to the Department of Fish and Wildlife in regard to projects, and the hydraulic projects are projects like bulkheads and rock walls and docks, piers, dredging, all that kind of thing. And the biggest thing this bill does, in my mind, so it gives them more authority to regulate, you know, if somebody builds without a permit on the shoreline, they can issue stronger fines than they're currently able to do and more quickly. And then the other thing is that right now, they're required to issue permits on single residential family properties for bulkheads and rock walls. It's like an exemption that these single family residences on the shoreline can automatically get a permit for a bulkhead or a rock wall. And that exemption goes away because they really recognize how important the natural beaches are in terms of forage fish spawning, and that if you build a bulkhead, it scours the beaches, it removes that, you know, beautiful natural environment for the forage fish to spawn in. So it's a great improvement in terms of the southern resident food web. And so this bill passed 59 to 39, and with some bipartisan support, and it's moving forward, which is great. This bill, 1578, our new representative, Deborah Lekanoff, is the prime sponsor of this bill. This was a governor-requested bill, as was the previous one. So this bill does a couple of things that's great. Remember we talked about articulated tug and barges and how they don't have requirements for tug escorts when they're laden, when they're full of oil products. So one of the things this bill does is it addresses the need to increase the requirements for tug escorts where there currently aren't those requirements. And that's still intact in the bill. It also addresses positioning a new emergency response towing vessel like the emergency tug out at Nia Bay, and positioning that here in the San Juans to be able to respond to vessels in distress in Rosario Strait and in Haro Strait Boundary Pass to the waterways surrounding our islands. Really good news, and originally the bill included language that gave ecology the authority to have a rulemaking to require this new emergency response towing vessel, although the bill also gives the legislative intent that they'd like this asset to be funded in a transboundary manner, both, you know, from British Columbia and Washington State, but it had this language originally, and this was like after all the hearings, after all the testimony, the cargo industry negotiated to have that section removed. They wanted to have an exemption so that they wouldn't be required to pay for an additional emergency response towing vessel, and so it became a choice of either remove the section as they did, and this passed on the House floor, or to just kill the bill, or to provide this exemption to the cargo industry, which really didn't make sense. And ironically, when the Nia Bay Rescue Tug was first established, the first funding that was secured to establish the rescue tug at Nia Bay, it was because of the new Carissa oil spill in 1999, and the new Carissa was a cargo ship. So, you know, it's so unfortunate. And it again points to that pattern we have. Like with the Exxon Valdez oil spill, that prompted the Oil Prevention Act of 1990 that made a huge difference in terms of oil spill prevention at a federal level. And then here we have the new Carissa cargo ship oil spill in 1999 that prompted the stationing of an emergency response towing vessel at Nia Bay. So hopefully we can move forward with this, you know, better oil spill prevention without a spill in the Salish Sea. So this bill, 1580, House Bill 1580 and Senate Bill 5577, this was a bill that addressed the impacts of the smaller vessels, the whale watch and recreational vessels on southern resident killer whales. Originally, it was proposing to change the distance you have to keep from southern residents from 200 yards to 400 yards, and that got changed to 300 yards with 400 yards from behind. There was also a provision that basically put a suspension on southern resident killer whale watching for a number of years, and that language got removed. The Pacific Whale Watch Association was successful in lobbying against that portion. But it does create a go slow zone. So this is a requirement for boats to just go 7 knots when they're within half a mile of the southern residents. And this does make a big difference in terms of the noise from the vessels. So if they're going slower, they're not as loud, they're not as impactful to the southern residents. So that's a great new provision that's in the current bill. And then there's also the bill also includes a requirement to establish a limited entry whale watch permitting system. So it would create a permitting system so we could put a cap on the number of whale watch businesses there are and have some regulations around things like, how many boats can be with the whales at any one time, hours of operation, that kind of thing. So, and that's moving forward. And so this was, so I have the numbers on the vote here, but this got quite a bit of bipartisan support. It passed 78-20 in the House and 46-3 in the Senate. So our new Senator Liz Lovell, this was one of her bills, and it requires that when you get your boater, it requires whale watching guidelines to be part of the boater education program. And this actually passed on the Senate floor unanimously last Thursday, so she's off to a good start with this bill. But hopefully this will help things like this from not happening. You can see these boats are just, they're not, this is back when the distance is 200 yards, and you can estimate that they're closer than 200 yards to that poor southern resident there. So hopefully better education will help prevent that with boaters. Okay, so now I'm going to start talking about the budget. So March 20th is when the state will issue its revenue forecast. And after March 20th, the budget proposals from the House and Senate, from the Democrats and Republicans, will be put forward, and that process will begin to for both the operating and the capital budget for the state. So this is an example of programs that are within the capital budget. The Salmon Recovery Funding Board, Puget Sound Acquisition and Restoration, and the Estuary and Salmon Restoration Program. And these are the programs that fund projects that are extremely well vetted. They're what you would call shovel ready. So these are projects that are like ready to go once they get funded. They've been vetted, they've been prioritized, and traditionally they've been funded at 30 to 50% in each of the bienniums. And the governor's requested budget to the legislature increases that somewhat, but it's still not, the governor's requested budget is not full funding for these projects, and so we're hoping you can help advocate for full funding of these programs within the capital budget this year. If there's 1 year where we can fully fund these programs with so much focus on the southern residents, this should be the year when we can do that. Also happening at the state level, the ecology is updating the regulations, state regulations for oil spill contingency plan requirements. And these are the requirements for what shippers have to do to be, what they have to fund to be prepared to respond to a spill should it happen. And one of the things that ecology is directed to do is specifically address non-floating oils like the Canadian crude oil, the Alberta tar sand, diluted bitumen that gets shipped through our waters already, and if that transbound pipeline expansion happens, that'll increase significantly. So in August, they'll be issuing a draft, and we'll be communicating with folks on our email list about our recommended comments to ecology about that proposed rule update. And then at the federal level, so one of the recommendations that came out of the Southern Resident Killer Whale Task Force was a prohibition on offshore oil drilling. Again, to that offshore oil drilling would increase the risk of an oil spill tremendously, and that could impact the orcas because they spend a lot of time on the outer coast. But that's a tough recommendation to implement at the state level. But fortunately, there is a bill in the House of Representatives at the federal level. Our own Rick Larson's one of the co-sponsors. Probably not a lot of success projected for this bill, but hopefully in a future administration it can move forward. Okay, so actions you can take, why we're all here today. And again, I'll send some more information to Barbara to help out. But I think, first and foremost, just educating yourself. And then as you implement changes in your own life and take action, educating your friends and neighbors and your family. One obvious thing is if you do eat salmon, don't eat the salmon that orca eat. So sockeye or pinks, they typically don't eat at all. Don't add to the pollution that's going into our marine waters. Use salmon-safe, orca-safe products in your home and especially out in your garden, especially if you live on the shoreline. Be good stewards of the shorelines for all those little juvenile fish that are coming to get big before they have to go out to the open ocean. And then there's some disagreement about whether the southern residents need a specific allocation of Chinook salmon. But that's something that the Fish and Wildlife issued a paper in January that I'm going to send a link to that to Barbara. And they're saying they don't need an allocation. They're saying there's plenty of fish for the southern residents. But that's hard to reconcile when the scientists are telling us they're starving. And they can't carry their pregnancies to full term and successfully give birth to healthy calves. And that's a big issue in terms of why the population isn't increasing. That whales are getting pregnant, but they're not able to carry those births, pregnancies to full term. So, so there's some information here about how you can advocate with our Fish and Wildlife Commission, the State Fish and Wildlife Commission, about that. But there are a number of different agencies that deal with the fish allocation. Supporting the current legislation that's making its way through the legislature. Fortunately, with the work of the task force, the needs of the southern residents have a big focus in the legislature this year, and some of those bills are moving forward, which is great. And then a big issue, though, is going to be when we get to the point of the funding. So when they are making decisions about the capital budget and the operating budget, so many of the programs associated with the bills that are going through the process now depend on what the outcome of the budget process is. So advocating for funding for the southern residents during that process will be really important. Elect environmentalists. That's a really big one. And let your elected officials know that recovering and protecting the southern residents is a priority. Just even without sharing, specifically what you want them to do, let them know that you as a constituent, that's really important. It's a challenge for our representatives at the federal level to take action right now in the current administration, but you can still let them know that that's important to you. I talked about how Washington State ferries are, there's so many ferry transits on our waters, and because of the high volume of ferry transits on our waters, they are impactful to the orcas just by the sheer volume of the amount of time they're out there on the water. And there's a long-range plan that Washington State Ferries has put forward that calls for the construction of new, more reliable, we can all get on board with that, new, quieter, hybrid-capable ferries. And so supporting that long-range plan and capital budget allocations for Washington State Ferries to implement that will be really important and just make a huge difference to us as islanders that depend on the ferries. Yes, David?
What is hybrid capable?
So my understanding is that they're like plug-in hybrid capable. So they can run on electricity, and when they're at the dock, Opalco is working with Washington State Ferries on their ability to be able to plug in. It's maybe not all of the San Juan County docks, but some of them, and charge up their batteries and be able to run on electricity, but they would still have a diesel engine component. So they would be hybrid, electric, diesel that way. Yeah. And then the big thing too is it's not just, so this is really beneficial in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, that would make a huge difference, but then also the design would hopefully be quieter so that their noise wouldn't impact the orcas as much. And then we've got a website that has an action page for how you can support Southern residents, and we keep that updated, and we have a constant contact email list. We send out occasional calls for action when the opportunity arises. So if you want to, that's the clipboard I sent around, but that's a great way to keep informed about actions you can take. And that's it.
Good job.
All right. Lori?
I'm curious, you didn't mention undamming rivers in Washington State, which I always thought was a pretty important issue around the salmon.
Absolutely.
Could you talk a little bit
Yeah.
about that?
So the southern residents they're clearly not in our waters all the time. They're out on the coast a lot of the time. And some of the pods go all the way down to Northern California and eat fish off the coast of Northern California, but certainly they're off the coast of the Columbia River and eating the Chinook salmon there. And so the Snake River dams, that's something that is a priority. The challenge is that so I think where the state is at, it's not a decision that can be made just within the state. It's a multi-state and federal decision process. And one of the challenges is getting the stakeholders who depend on the dams for their own livelihoods, how to make that, how to make the outcome of the dam removal right for them. So it's a process that's underway, and I think the state is initiating funding to address that stakeholder process that's needed. But the other thing they're doing right now is increasing the spill at those dams, and there's an expedited process that will do that, and that will increase the amount of smolts that can get over the dams and hopefully successfully then come back and.
So you see progress being made.
But
in this
incremental,
direction.
not to the
Not a
extent
lot.
that people want. I mean, the dams are not scheduled for removal immediately. It's not going to happen right away, and that is an important step. But there again, once the dams are removed, we're still years away from those adult salmon that the orca can eat, right? So even if the dams came down tomorrow, we would still be, 5 years away from those larger fish that could really make a difference in their diet. Yeah.
I just have a question that's probably naive, but is the dam so tall that you couldn't build a series of fish ladders below it for a couple of miles?
So my understanding is there is fish passage infrastructure in the dams already, but still it's an obstacle for them to do that. Tom?
Yes, there are fish ladders there. And of course, if you take the dams down, you eliminate the hydropower, which is kind of a negative thing. I used to work for the Corps of Engineers, and I'm going to call up the division headquarters and find out if there's any way that they can improve the efficiency of the fish ladders there on the Snake River dams rather than take them down, because although that would be positive for the fish, it would be negative for hydropower in general. And the other, as long as I'm here, the other question I have is, do we still allow fishing for Chinook salmon?
Yes.
Can't we cut that out somehow? Why don't we do that?
So that's one of the recommendations, is to advocate for an allocation of Chinook salmon for the southern residents. So when they're when they're making their projections of how many fish there are going to be, and they're allocating the fish to all the different, the tribes take care of their 50% in terms of their allocations, and then Department of Fish and Wildlife for Washington State allocates to the commercial fisheries, the recreational fisheries. The idea is, should we be asking for an allocation specifically for the southern residents? Or, should we be looking at closing fisheries when the orcas are present, so that they can get the fish when they're here? Yes, Tom?
Yeah, Lovell, I have a question regarding trying to regulate shipping traffic noise. These would be tankers and cargo ships, and particularly in Peril Strait, where there's so many of them now, and they're transiting the whole into the Peril Strait. We have one ferry that goes across an average of 3 transits a day, but we have ships in there 24 hours. And I know they did a go slow test,
Mhm.
what was it, last summer? Or maybe this summer.
Last 2 summers, yeah.
And if there's any evidence that that made a difference, and if Canada and the US be thinking about regulating the noise from those ships, like Washington State ferries and stuff, with some of their vessels.
Yeah. So in terms of the large commercial ships, they're regulated by the International Maritime Organization, the IMO. And the IMO is aware of the commercial vessel traffic impacts to marine mammals, like our southern residents. And they're looking at they are in the very slow process of identifying, recommendations that could become requirements for the construction of new ships so that they're quieter in terms of the propeller design, that kind of thing. But also just ship maintenance makes a big difference. Just keeping the hull clean, and if you, Val Veers was one of the authors of a study that showed that 15% of the vessels in our that go through Harrow Strait generated half the noise. So these were bad actors. These were exceptionally loud ships because they had a ding in their propeller and they just grind away making this awful noise or whatever. And so, one way to eliminate 50% of the vessel noise in the commercial ships is just to get rid of the bad actors. I forget the term they use. I'm saying bad actors, but they have another term for those exceptionally loud vessels. Really the IMO needs to take action to regulate the ships in terms of international travel. But what is happening up in Canada and what they're trying to implement here in Washington State, Canada has the ECHO program, the Enhanced Cetacean Habitat and Observation Program. And they have to do it voluntarily, so they can't require this of vessels, but they've had a high degree of participation. So they've done 2 trials last year and the year before where they asked vessels to slow down in Harrow Strait. And they were monitoring the effectiveness of that, and it did decrease the noise. And they had a very good participation rate. And then last year they did this lateral displacement. So they asked the vessels to slightly relocate within the traffic lanes to avoid peak foraging areas in the Strait of Juan de Fuca. And that, I think, was all. I haven't seen the results of that yet, but apparently that was successful also, and they definitely had a good degree of participation. Again, those have to be voluntary, but they have been successful that way. And then one of the things that Washington State is trying to do is to establish their own program, like the ECHO program in Canada, so that they can work on some best practices for vessels, hopefully, with good participation for the vessel traffic routes here in Washington State. Audra.
Different subject, but I was thinking one thing that's easy for people to do. Do you have a list of these safe products? I mean, it's one thing for us to write letters to the legislature, but it's another thing to change our behavior at Browns or whatever.
Yeah.
So do you have a list of these salmon safe and orca safe products?
I'll try to get the website updated with a link, but there are, I think that, I know at Ace Hardware, they try to let you know which products those are. But I'll try to make sure we either have a link to a list or get one. Gina.
Just to add to what I said about tankers earlier, there have been vessels that are registered in Panama, and apparently on occasion, I think that I heard there were 2 situations where the captain didn't speak the same language as some of the crew members.
Frequently happens.
I didn't say that, but anyway, I think there are just so many problems that we all need to be aware of and deal with as best we can. And
Yeah.
become active.
And the ability to communicate with the crew is something that the Coast Guard inspects for, and that I know that has been an issue, but and that's a concern. We do have pilots who, for those vessels calling on a Washington State port, the pilots get on board near Port Angeles, and so then. And they're, mariners who know our waterways and, have gone through all the training to be pilots. And so it's great to have an expert pilot on board who knows the waterways to get the boat safely to harbor and back out again. Likewise for ships calling on ports in Vancouver. I don't know if I mentioned this, but that's the biggest port in Canada, so that's why there's so much vessel traffic there. But they also have pilots that get on board near Victoria, and so they've got a professional local mariner on board ships to get them safely to harbor and back out again. Alice?
Well, you had a slide that showed the two very different chart, a graph that showed two very different paths of recovery of two pods after the Exxon.
Oh yeah, I can go
lobbies.
back to that.
And did they know what accounted for that very, I mean, one survived and one didn't? Oh,
No,
I'm sorry. I think-
so these are just two distinct pods of orcas. And part of it had to do with, so if you can see, so this vertical line here is when the spill occurred in '89, that black line there. So the AT1 population had a lower population prior to the spill, maybe that was a factor. And it just depends on where they were in relationship to the spill and how much of the, material they inhaled, or, how they were affected by the spill. And I don't know all the details of that.
Well, wouldn't it be, because that's resident versus transient, one of the things that strikes me about going, up the Salish Sea, up past Vancouver Island and so on, is the tremendous difference in behavior between transients and residents. Residents tend to stay where they are, whereas the transients are much freer to leave. And so if they're saying, if this water is awful, why, maybe they're leaving on purpose.
Actually, in terms of our waters here, the transient populations are here more often than the residents are. I mean, it's kind of ironic, but that's currently the case. So the transient whales who, eat seals and other mammals and have plenty to eat, they're here more than the southern residents who only eat fish. They only, and primarily Chinook fish.
But we're talking now about oil nasty waters, okay?
Yep.
I wonder if there was many seals there or whatever. Okay, so we don't need to talk about this a lot, but it did strike me that there's a difference between resident and transients.
Maybe that, and I don't know that much about it, so that could be a factor for sure. Yeah. Who's been waiting a long time? Yes.
Yeah, just back to the four lower Snake River dams, my understanding is that those are costing more to operate than the generating power.
Yes,
I've heard
that's
that
true.
not an excuse.
Yeah.
They're
Yeah.
not coming down, and that Inslee doesn't need federal approval. The studies have been done, and Inslee could call the Corps and have them reach this.
Yeah, I don't think it's so simple as that. I mean, I don't think, but I don't know exactly. My understanding is it really has to be a multi-state and and there has to be the federal component as well for the removal to happen. But it is, but you're right, that they're not, it's costing more to operate them than the electricity they're generating at this time, yeah.
Well, if that's true, then there's more power to find an alternative source of energy for the people and let the fish swim up. That's like a no-brainer. I have not heard that before, but that is very interesting. You put forward a very interesting possibility that would certainly support the removal of the dam.
It's not just the power.
No.
Those dams help agriculture.
Yeah, so there's,
Those tonight, they barge, millions of tons of grain
Yeah.
from the floods down the river. There's a series of locks with each
Mhm.
dam. And they're big barges that are loaded up along the river. And so most of that grain is produced over in the home, the Booths area, goes down to the Snake River and is barged up to Portland and gets shipped offshore. So that's a huge,
and those are some of the,
Cost-effective methods.
element of transportation to get that grain down.
Yeah, there's improvements in cost-effective ways to get that in the markets.
Going back to prevention, if I remember correctly, and it's a long time ago, at the Exxon Valdez, there was a significant number of tankers that only had single hulls.
right.
And they said that double hull would have prevented a lot of that. Has there been significant movement on that? Are most of the tankers today double-hulled?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep, that's absolutely true, yes. And now there's a move to have double hull, the fuel that's used for operating the vessels, to have those tanks also double hulled and independent, yes. Yeah, and that definitely has improved the safety, for sure, yep. Laura Jo.
This is kind of off the left field a bit, but since today's laundry day for most of us, whether or not, but the amount of polyester, I thought about this because I put on this thing and I thought maybe I needed to wash it. And I've been using a bag to catch all the little bits and pieces of polyester that come off the fleece when you wash it. And you can order them online for about $30, and my drain water goes out into a septic tank, but I imagine if I live long enough, it might fill up with little plastic bits. But,
At least you did it.
yeah, but, you know, most of us that live in town or on the sewer system, all this little plastic goes out and passes through the different fish and eventually ends up, something like a large percentage of fish that are caught for food have plastic bits in them. And and there's a young woman who presented this to the county council. I don't know her name, but she's Victoria Compton's daughter. Mm-hmm. And it's a very serious issue that we can address, at least on a small scale level here.
Yeah, so even the microplastics in salt, are showing up, so, and that is a huge issue. What I didn't include in the update on legislation that's working its way through the state legislature is there's a plastic bag bill that would require, as I recall, the current bill has, that stores would have to charge 8 cents for you to have a bag, unless you bring your own, and that there would be no more single-use plastic bags. Unfortunately, they do allow plastic bags to be used of a thicker size, so it's not a complete elimination of plastic bags, but it does eliminate those very flimsy single-use grocery bags. And our county did implement a requirement that way, but again, we have that exemption for the thicker plastic bags.
I was wondering about the oil spills. You said instead of hitting a small craft, they're going to crash. But what is the main cause of these oil spills?
Well, that's a decision we don't want any ship captain or pilot to have to make, like between loss of life and an environmental disaster.
Yeah.
We don't want them to ever have to make that choice.
But what is the main cause of oil spills?
The main cause of oil spills? I would say human error. Yeah. Yeah. Of one form or another, yes.
Wasn't that guy drunk?
That would be human error, yeah.
For sure. That's about as human error as you can get.
Yeah. Laura Jo.
One more thing though, back what Chita said about sometimes the captains and the crew not speaking the same language. The rules that have changed in this country since the early 1980s have done away with subsidies for the American merchant marine. And so it's had a big impact on ships either becoming foreign flag ships like the ones registered in Liberia or Panama. And a lot of companies, by the time you get through the legal chain who actually owns the ship, you don't know. And there are lots of ships that are maintained on just a, very poor level. And the 20 years that my husband spent working for the marine industry, the steering goes out. The controls that operate the power system go out. The power system goes out. That happens. The lights go out. And these are all things that if you don't have regular maintenance, you're not going to prevent. And I don't know. They suddenly discovered it's hard to ship your military supplies, that was the whole purpose of supporting the merchant marine, was having, having American military supplies be dependable, be able to ship them. And you can't exactly depend on it, you call up, well, Mr. Ship Owner for Panamanian registry ship, please help us ship some rifles or whatever weapons we need, and that'd be real easy to control and prevent. So it's a serious issue, and it's, may or may not happen. We're going back to supporting the U.S. registered ships.
So one thing that is true is that ships are typically individual limited liability corporations to limit their, what they're exposed to if they get into an accident. And that's a real concern. So, the U.S. Coast Guard does have high standards in terms of the ships that call on U.S. ports and what they're required to have in terms of liability insurance and what they have to meet in terms of safety and mechanical sufficiency. But I think it's true that there are some ships that are better maintained than others. That's for sure the truth.
Yeah, following, you can go online and follow the, tracking ships going up and down the Harris Strait, and they'll tell you what they're carrying and who all, what registry they are. And that's interesting, I do it because I can look out my window and see them go by.
Yeah.
What website is that?
I'll have to look it up, I'll do that. It's something that's done by, what is it?
Boat finder.
Well, no, the one I'm thinking of is one that's done by,
It's marine traffic.
Oh, is it?
Marine traffic.
yeah,
There are a bunch of them.
there are several of them, and they don't show military vessels. And they aren't, if you look out, it might be where it was, 50 miles to the south, but it's the general area where it's going.
Well, so right now, there's a container ship, the SM Tiger, that's just north of Turn Point, heading towards Canada. And then there are two ships crossing paths just north of that. I wish I could put this up on the screen. But yeah, this is the marine traffic, and it's great. I mean, I can just pass my phone around, but it shows you the ships, and then you can click on them, and it shows you more about the ships. And then you can, if you pay for the use of the app, then it gives you even more information. So, yes.
Could you flash back to your slide that showed the budget requests?
So this was just for the few programs that deal with restoration and protection of shoreline. So this is so the agency request for the Salmon Recovery Funding Board. So like when Tina Whitman, who's our science director, when she does restoration projects here in San Juan County, typically the funding comes from either the Salmon Recovery Funding Board or the Puget Sound Acquisition and Restoration Fund. So like the Salmon Recovery Board, what their ask is $88.9 million, and what the governor's recommendation to the legislature is for $35 million. So, and typically each biennium, those funds are only funded 30 to 50% of what the request is. So we're really trying to make a push this year to get them fully
If
funded.
they could do a cost-benefit analysis and throwing money, I mean, it's most people, it's like throwing money at a system that they don't know what it's gonna recover. And a cost, to show that if you do this, this is what you recover in some way.
That's hard to do though, because like, let's say you do a restoration project where there had been a forage fish spawning beach and you get it back to a functional level, so it's the forage fish are spawning again. Can you make a direct link between the forage fish and the salmon and the orca? It's harder to do, but, I mean, we see the value there, but, yeah.
But if you could show how dollars come back in some way, or the fish come back in some way, it's just money being thrown at a system that you don't know what you're getting back.
Yeah.
I think it's hard for people to swallow.
Yeah. Yep. list.
Do you feel that there's good coordination between the US, state, local, federal government and the Canadian government? Is that, do they, I know there's different recommendations and then there's different implementations, and how do you think that's all working?
Well, what's interesting is for years, Friends of the San Juans has really been pushing for more transboundary coordination. And ironically, last year, there were 2 parallel tracks that got started. So starting last year, the Washington State Legislature required what they call the Salish Sea Shared Waters Forum. And it was in October last year. I think it's going to be in November this year. And unfortunately, it's just a state provincial transboundary forum. And then also last year, through the Puget Sound Harbor Safety Committee, they started joint meetings happening twice a year with their fellow organizations in Canada. But that's happening at a federal to federal level. And it's unfortunate that it's not totally coordinated, but better too much than nothing at all, So, and I think there are, so for example, like I was showing you the map of the vessel traffic lanes and how the US and Canada coordinate in the management of vessel traffic. And I think they do a good job just between themselves, the Canadian Coast Guard and the US Coast Guard. But one of the challenges is that in the US, we have this Puget Sound Harbor Safety Committee. Incidents are, the committee is open to the public, the meetings are open to the public. It's very inclusive. I wasn't an official member for years, and I always spoke up, and, very open, transparent process. Incidents were shared. In Canada, it's a different system, and so one of the challenges I had is they never reported on incidents in Harrow Strait and Boundary Pass, as if like, oh, nothing happens here. But it was that the U.S. couldn't report on incidents that Canada was in charge of. And I don't know if you remember, years ago there was, it wasn't that long ago, I can't remember what it was, but there was a front page picture in the Journal of a barge just off of Limetown State Park that was tilting.
Yes.
Or maybe it was the county park.
It was.
Yeah. And I took that paper down to the Harbor Safety Committee and I said, what about this incident? And they were like, oh, Canada's taking care of that. And I'm like, you guys, these are, I don't know if you've read about the pig war, but really, San Juan County, we are in Washington State, we are in U.S. waters, these are U.S. shorelines. We are not abdicating our responsibility to protect these shorelines, And, they get that, but they don't get it. So hopefully there's going to be more, one of the goals of this transboundary process is to have more transparent data sharing. And to implement a proactive process like the standard of care process that we have here with the Puget Sound Harbor Safety Committee for the Canadian organization. It's called PACMAR, and unfortunately I can't tell you what that acronym stands for, but that's a very closed process. Only industry participates. They don't have any environmental reps or any other different stakeholders besides industry. It's very closed. And they don't have the proactive standard of care process that we have here. So anyways, hopefully things will change and improve that way. But really, the reality is we haven't had a major spill in decades. And we are very fortunate that we have had that safety record. But by no means can we get complacent, right? That's the worst thing that could happen is that we think, oh, it's all good, we don't have to do anything. It's a constant need for improvement, need to, address where the problems are and make sure accidents don't happen.
Well, and also the whale watch boats. I was thinking, is there coordination between Canadian and Victoria whale watch boats?
They come across those major commercial traffic lanes, I know, that's concerning.
Yeah, but also, do they abide by the 400 yards away from, which they don't seem to?
Well, so Canada just got, so we had the 200, we have the 200-yard distance in place now, and Canada was, I think, 100 yards, but they just upped it to 200 yards. So right now, at this minute, we're the same, US and Canada. But that could change with the outcome of the legislation that's going through the process right now. Yeah.
Do you know if any progress has been made on Canada's dumping waste into the water? Because that's always been an issue too.
Yeah,
Is that
absolutely. Yeah, yes. So they are building a sewage treatment plant.
Oh, they
Yes.
are?
God, we've heard that for years.
But at least they're in process.
Yeah, it's under construction, and I don't know the due date for that. Does anybody know the due date for that completion? I can find out. Let me write this down. I'll send that to Barbara.
Take a while.
Last fall, there was a very large meeting in Vancouver about water problems and whale problems with representatives from here and in Canada. And I suspect you could probably find that online. I couldn't tell you where, but if you Google it, you'll probably be able to find it. And they'll have a summary. And it's worth looking at. And Janet Thomas was there, so she could probably tell you more about it. Unfortunately, she's in Nepal right now.
Yeah, okay.
And one other thing, tell Roche Harbor to stop having this contest to see who can catch the biggest Chinook salmon. Stop it. Tell them.
So this is the blackmouth derby, and the blackmouth Chinook salmon, that they're unlike the other Chinook that outmigrate to the open ocean. My understanding is the blackmouth, their entire life cycle is they're right here in these waters. And you're right. I think, yeah, the fishing derbies, that is an ironic situation and an issue. But if they have the derbies in the winter when the whales aren't here, I don't know if that makes a difference or not. But yeah, so that's something, that's an action, you can take, is to look at the derbies that prioritize Chinook salmon.
There were 3 derbies just by February this year.
Here in San Juan
There
County.
was the Friday Harbor Classic, it was the Roche Harbor, and then I think it was one on August.
There was Ida Nielsen.
Why don't they make it part of the derbies? You catch the fish, you measure it, take a picture of it, and throw it back.
Yeah.
A lot of derbies in San Diego, that's what they have to do. It's catch and release.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Good idea.
Donald Trump knows about that.
Audra?
When all the serious questions have been asked, I have something to say.
I think we're good. Sorry.
One more. What percentage, you see all those fishing boats out off South Beach, what percentage are fishing for Chinook salmon?
Well, it depends on what the season is and what
It
the
does.
fishery is, what's open.
Okay.
Yeah, and I couldn't tell
So
you.
you're not sure how much Chinook, how much the pink,
But those aren't the fishermen that are the problem. I
They're
think
not.
it's the
Okay.
Persingers and
I would put
nets out
purse in
there.
nets.
Although just the boat traffic itself is an issue too. Like we were showing with the presence of boats causing the whales to expend more energy to forage, and also they avoid the boats, so they're traveling more. Yeah.
And there's nothing that says you can't have more than so many boats at one time at this point.
No, not at this point. There is the voluntary, the west side of San Juan Island voluntary exclusion area. And so that's something to support. Yeah. Yeah, and that's been, the San Juan County Marine Resources Committee has some information about that, and also Washington State Department of Fish and Wildlife was promoting that this last year. Yeah. Any other burning questions before Audra takes the floor?
I wonder what Audra's not going to be serious.
All right, well, thank you.
Okay, I'm ready. Thank you, that was really good. But this question is partly for you too. Okay. If you agree that cupcakes are orca safe and salmon safe, then I would like you to encourage the group to help themselves.
Yes, please do.
And they're lean cupcakes.
All right.
And no calories.
Well, Lovell, thank you so much. That was a wonderful.
Yeah, thank you all for having me. Thank you.